Good evening, everybody. My name is Martin Oehmke. I'm a professor of finance here at the LSE, and I'm also a program director in the Financial Markets Group, FMG. And on behalf of the Financial Markets Group, I'd like to welcome you to the second Sir Oliver Hart lecture. It's a hybrid event, so we've got people here in the room, so welcome to those of you physically present, but also welcome to those joining us online for this lecture. Let me just say one sentence, if you're not familiar with the FMG, about the FMG. FMG was established at the LSE here in 1987 by Charles Goodhart and Mervyn King. And since then, over the decades since then, it's played a leading role in informing policy for the betterment of society, bringing together academics, policymakers, regulators, and market participants. And so last year, the FMG introduced this particular, still relatively new lecture series, the lecture series in honor of Sir Oliver Hart. And I'm very happy that Oliver is here with us tonight. So welcome, Oliver. Where are you sitting? There you are. Welcome to the second of these lectures. Last year, the inaugural lecture was delivered by Luigi Zingales on reforming capitalism. Luigi might also be here. There you are, Luigi. Welcome to you. Today, then, we're doing the second lecture, and it's my particular pleasure to introduce to you today's speaker, Patrick Bolton. And I'll just say just a few words before handing over to Patrick and talking to you about some logistics before Patrick starts. Patrick is a professor of finance and economics at Imperial College, and over his career he's made path-breaking contributions to a number of fields in economics, IO, corporate finance and banking, the economics of sovereign debt, just to name a few. We could name more, but we'd be here for too long. A common theme in a lot of Patrick's work, and this is not unlike Oliver's, is a focus on contracting, often in settings where contracts remain incomplete. And Patrick's book, joined with Mathieu de Vatripon on contract theory, probably still is the go-to reference in that field. Even though, Patrick, you are currently further southwest in London at Imperial, Patrick has a strong connection to the LSE and also to the FMG. Patrick did his PhD here at LSE, and then in the 1990s was a professor in the economics department at LSE, and also a member of the Financial Markets Group at that time. And he also has a strong connection that I want to mention to Oliver Hart, who, if my information is correct, was Patrick's undergraduate tutor at Cambridge. Yeah, lots of connections to LSE, to Oliver. And in fact, while we're talking about connections, I was fortunate to take courses during my PhD at Princeton from Patrick. And then after I'd started my career at Columbia, work on a number of papers with Patrick. And I feel, now as I work on my research to this day, I profit on any project I'm doing now from what I learned from Patrick when we were working together. Now, before Patrick will speak about elements of a theory of the socially responsible firm, just a couple of logistics. There's a hashtag for tonight's event, hashtag LSE Event. So if you want to be on social media, that's the hashtag to use. We'll also record this event, and hopefully it'll be made available as a podcast, subject to not having any technical difficulties doing this. There'll be a Q&A after the lecture. If you're in the online audience, at any time during the lecture, you can submit your questions via the Q&A feature at the top left of your screen. Please let us know your affiliation, your name, and we're always happy to hear from alumni or students. If you're in the audience, then raise your hand, wait for the microphone, and then ask your question, but I'll repeat that as we go to the questions later on. There will also be, and I'll put the reminder out at the end again, there'll also be a reception afterwards in the atrium in this building. So everybody, it's open to everybody. Everybody is welcome to join us for the reception afterwards. But now I'm pleased to hand over to Patrick for his lecture on the elements of a theory of the responsible firm. Thank you.
Thank you, Martin, for this kind introduction. It's a special, and I would like to thank also, of course, the organizers for inviting me to give this lecture. It's a special moment for me to be here at LSE and to give this lecture with Oliver Hart in the audience, and this being the Sir Oliver Hart Lecture. I owe a huge debt of gratitude to Oliver. And I'm happy to be able to say this in public. Martin mentioned that I had the great privilege to have Oliver as my tutor in Cambridge at Churchill College. Everything I've learned in economics, everything of importance, I've learned from Oliver. And Oliver is also responsible for bringing me to the LSE, where I did my PhD under his supervision. And I'm also grateful to Oliver for inviting me to come to MIT when he moved to MIT as a visiting scholar. And of course, I've always looked up on everything that Oliver does. It's always been a very important guiding light in my career. So, Oliver, thank you. And I would also like to thank the London School of Economics for everything that it gave me. I spent wonderful years here as a PhD student, later on the faculty, wonderful years at the Financial Markets Group, and it's just a great pleasure to be back here. What I'm going to talk about is under the title Elements of a Theory of the Responsible Firm, and I made sure that I wouldn't have social in the title. So you'll see why I say responsible firm and not socially responsible firm. So here's the outline. I'm going to first remind you of some basic key ideas on the theory of the firm. As economists have studied it, and I put this deliberately, somewhat provokingly, under the heading Theory of the Firm in the Garden of Eden, meaning economists have developed a lot of this thinking, these ideas, in a world that was different from the world we're in today. And the key difference is that we are today in the Anthropocene. And because we are in the Anthropocene, we really have to think about a theory of the responsible firm. Now, of course, there have been other thought given earlier to economic responsibility. You'll see in a second, well, in a few slides, some important contributions. But I think these ideas are particularly important because of the new world we live in. So I'll develop the key ideas in my mind on what is a responsible firm, or what the theory of the responsible firm is, and then I will move on part 3 on practical implications, and then I will end on part 4 on the economic responsibility of investors, and then I'll conclude. So. Theory of the firm in the Garden of Eden, well, two fundamental ideas we teach our students is the idea that competitive equilibrium is Pareto efficient, of course, under some conditions. And along with that, this is what we teach economic students and finance students. We teach about the Fisher separation theorem. This is all in if you want, these are results that hold in an Arrow-Debreu model. In the Arrow-Debreu model, the firm is a black box, and the firm's owners unanimously agree to maximize profits. So this is the Fisher separation idea. If you want to understand how firms should behave, what their objective function should be, it's simple: maximization of profits. The theory of the firm starts with Coase. And Coase asked two inconvenient questions. I'll give you the second question in a few slides. Let me start with the first question. Coase asked, why is production organized in firms? Why aren't all transactions, market transactions in markets, are efficient? And you want a modern version of that. Why aren't we doing all transactions online with apps? Why do we have firms? And the answer is obvious. We have firms because markets are not efficient. So any attempt to answer this first question involves introducing market inefficiencies. And when you have these market inefficiencies, pursuit of self-interest is not generally in the public interest. A key follower of Coase, Oliver Williamson, pushed these ideas, and he emphasized ex post market inefficiencies. So his analysis was that inevitably contracts are incomplete, and therefore they leave contracting parties exposed to bad faith behavior. His description of how counterparties behave in the marketplace is that they tend to pursue their self-interest with guile, and that behavior is a source of transaction costs in spot markets. That's the source of inefficiency. So firms or organizations, in his mind, are a way of dampening this behavior, this pursuit of self-interest with guile, and of building long-term relationships, which he calls firms, and that's an efficiency improvement. Okay, so that's extending core ideas that you can already find in Coase. Crucially, Oliver Williamson also adds that shareholders have the most incomplete contractual protection. Therefore, in his mind, in his analysis, corporate governance should primarily be designed to protect shareholders' interests. So in a way, he's developing a second-best theory of shareholder primacy. Okay, let me now turn to Coase's second question, inconvenient question. Why not organize production in one big firm? Oliver Williamson does not give you an answer there. To get an answer to that question, you need to turn to Grossman, Hart, and Moore, property rights theory of the firm, which takes a different approach from Oliver Williamson and emphasizes ex-ante investment inefficiencies. So under Grossman, Hart, Moore, incomplete contracts expose relationship-specific investments to ex-post hold-up problems, and property rights or control rights provide protections against hold-up problems and incentivize relationship-specific investments. The flip side is that non-owners have lower incentives to make such investments. They have less protection. And here's a very powerful general principle from that analysis. I'm simplifying here a little bit, but I think I'm not simplifying too much. The general principle is that you want to give control rights to the agents whose investments create most value. Now, if you take that approach, you lose the idea of shareholder primacy that you find, for example, in Williamson. You could also have worker control rights. It all depends. It all depends on whose investments matter more. So if worker investments matter the most, you want to give workers control rights. So this theory answers Coase's second question and leaves open the question of shareholder primacy. Now, let me mention briefly a parallel or a first major contribution to a parallel literature that developed in management. And this is Freeman's Stakeholder Theory of the Corporation book. I want to just show this picture this is from an article, The Stakeholder Theory of the Corporation by Donaldson and Preston, to highlight that management, when he was thinking about firms, so different questions were being discussed, and there was more of an inquiry as to where does the firm fit in society more generally. So here you see that the stakeholder model can include many different stakeholders. And so then you might ask, well, where do you draw the line? Who counts as a stakeholder? Here, that's often a basic question that is not even asked, let alone given a reasonable answer. This article, however, by Donaldson and Preston, has some good insights. So I've quoted some key passages here I want to pass by you. So first of all, they say the stake of long-term employees who have worked to build and maintain a successful business operation is essentially based on effort. Then they look at more broadly, and they say the stake of people living in the surrounding community may be based on their need, safe or clean air, or the maintenance of their civic infrastructure. So that's how they are framing a broader stake. And then customer stakes are based on the satisfactions and protections implicitly promised in the market offer. They highlight that managers should acknowledge the validity of diverse stakeholder interests and should attempt to respond to them within a mutually supportive framework, because that is a moral requirement for the legitimacy of the management function. So that's the management perspective you can see here developed somewhat in parallel. And one final contribution on the part, on the first part of my talk that brings some of these ideas from management back to economics is by Henry Hansman, where he does study extensively multi-stakeholder governance, but tends to conclude that it's inefficient. And the reason why it's inefficient in his analysis is because of inter-stakeholder conflicts that results in inefficiencies. And his analysis is that governance by the stakeholder group with the most aligned member objectives tends to be the most efficient. That's how he frames it. And then it all depends in his analysis. The stakeholder group with the most aligned member objectives could be workers. And when you have that, then you tend to have worker cooperatives. And then that will be the form of organization of governance. And then it's the workers that would decide what objectives they would like to pursue. But Hansman adds that when it comes to the limited liability corporation, generally the stakeholder group with the most aligned member objectives tends to be shareholders. Why? Well, because shareholders tend to have a common interest in profits, in making money. And so in his analysis, that's why shareholders are best placed to govern a limited liability corporation. So that's another, coming back to the shareholder primacy through a slightly different line of attack. Let me now turn to the core of what I want to talk about today, which is the theory of the responsible firm in the Anthropocene. And here I thought you might enjoy this. This is from the New Yorker from a few years back. And that's the problem. When you look at the theory of the firm today, that's the problem we're facing. One cartoon gets to the bottom of what the issue is. Yes, the planet got destroyed, but for a beautiful moment in time, we created a lot of value for shareholders. That's the issue. This issue has first been tackled in economics and finance by Hart and Zingales. The title of their article speaks gives away the content. Companies should maximize shareholder welfare, not market value. So, by their analysis, social and environmental impact is something that shareholders may care about. Who says that shareholders only care about making money? Certainly in the new reality we're in, that may be too much of a simplification. Then they add that governments cannot always undo or efficiently regulate the social and environmental impact of corporate activity. And with that in mind, shareholders may want the firm to directly limit this social and environmental impact of the company's operation. And then they conclude by saying fiduciary duties should include social and environmental impact if that is what shareholders want. So that was the big opening of, if you want, this new topic that had basically been left aside up to their article in the theory, economic writing on the theory of the firm. So I want to go one step further and to go the extra step, talk about responsibility, economic responsibility. I'm actually going to rely on an article that was published in the Journal of Political Economy in 1916 by, at the time, a professor of economics at Chicago called Maurice Clark. So this is the article. I just came across this article by accident. It is somewhat known in management, but it's even in management is not really referred to a lot in the management literature. So he wrote an article, 1916, The Changing Basis of Economic Responsibility. That's the title of his article. And there's so many interesting bits in the article. I've just extracted the nuggets because he frames the issue so beautifully, and I couldn't have been able to frame it better. So he begins his article by contrasting two polar opposites. We're familiar with those polar opposites. One is laissez-faire, and here's what he says about laissez-faire. 20 years ago, economic responsibility meant self-reliance and self-dependence. It is possible that free contract would do more good than harm, even in the hands of wholly selfish and irresponsible population. Though nowadays there is more and more evidence to the contrary. That was in 1916. And then the other polar opposite, he says about government responsibility, some have gone to the other extreme, laying the burden on the impersonal state. And Maurice Clark advocates a middle ground in the article, corporate responsibility. Here's how he puts it. But most of us have not gone so far as that. Many men are honestly seeking to know what their obligations are in this new era, that they may meet them on their own initiative. Of course, he was writing in 1916. Today, you wouldn't use many men. You would be more gender conscious. Here's the key framing. Here's the key question he asks. Is there a twilight zone of obligations not yet enforced by law or custom, but no less real for that? If there is such a twilight zone, how shall we act toward it? And he observes something we're familiar with. Law and custom can at best never keep pace with the needs which they are made to meet. If men are responsible for known results of their actions, business responsibilities must include the known results of business dealings, whether these have been recognized by law or not. Which, in a way, for me, brings us back to Coase. As I pointed out earlier, the theory of the firm is founded on the idea of inefficient markets. And if you take on board Maurice Clark's notion of a twilight zone of obligations, that is going to be inevitably part of what forms the basis of a theory of the firm. So here's how Clark defines what I call Clark's responsibility principle. The ideal is to pay one's way, not to hurt others without compensation, to get value only for value given, and to leave the world in other respects just as one found it, or at least not to leave it the worse for one's presence. I think many of us can understand the meaning of this principle, and I thought I found it, echoes of this in the UN Brundtland report, Our Common Future, where it says in the report, humanity has the ability to make development sustainable to ensure that it meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. So, pretty much the first economist to put the topic of economic responsibility on the table was Maurice Clark, 1916. I don't think he had much of an impact. We would probably have his article on our reading lists if he really had the impact he deserved. The second economist I came across, who also wrote about this topic, is William Baumol. And he wrote in a book by the Committee for Economic Development in 1970 with the title A New Rationale for Corporate Social Policy. Now, Baumol is not as creative, if you want, as Maurice Clark. He frames it in much more, from our perspective today as economists, much more traditional terms. He thinks of the social dimension. He mostly talks about the social dimension of corporate purpose to be about philanthropy, and he thinks that philanthropy is a form of private provision of a public good. And here's what he says. Gifts by private firms are justified as a matter of self-interest, inasmuch as the deterioration of institutions such as universities and hospitals would no doubt have serious consequences for private enterprise. Yet it is also arguable that the business of the corporation is just business. So we've heard others make similar points later, but I think Baumol is probably the first to have articulated these ideas. I like the bit about universities and hospitals. So if it's arguable that business of the corporation is just business, how do you reconcile this dilemma? So his answer to that is corporate giving is appropriate so long as it serves the interests of the firm broadly defined. So that's how he gets away with addressing the dilemma. And then later in the article, he says that the sentence I picked out in highlighted in red because I thought it does reveal a lot of interesting, implicit thinking. So here's what he says: the term enlightened self-interest is a euphemism which refers to a combination of factors: the public pressures for a socially responsible stance on the part of the firm, the social conscience of management, and its hope that its own contributions will serve as an example to others. He's not completely wrong, of course, but I think this sentence, the reason why I picked it and why I also highlighted conscience, is this is very slippery. And so you need to come back to be maybe more explicit about what is meant by economic responsibility. So that's what I want to turn to next. And here I'm going to rely mostly on readings I found in management literature and in the law literature. So Lee Preston and James Post, they have a wonderful little book called Private Management and Public Policy. So this is actually a somewhat old book, but it's been reprinted in 2012. Here's how they frame the issue. One of the most vexing and central questions for managers and business and society scholars: what are the limits of corporate responsibility? And here's their answer: no firm can have unlimited responsibilities for everything, and yet no firm can reasonably expect society to hold it accountable for nothing. Right, so you take that idea. So we can't be responsible for everything, can't be responsible for nothing. It's a line drawing exercise, as they later highlight. I'll come to that in the next slide. But I thought, just to make this a bit concrete, I would bring up the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So if you think about economic responsibility from that perspective, I don't know what your reaction is, but my reaction is it's overwhelming. There's so many things you need to worry about. There are 17 different sustainable development goals. And I've just picked one as an example out of these 17. Goal 16, which is to promote peaceful and inclusive societies for sustainable development, has 12 targets and 14 publications and 1,038 actions. So just multiply that by 17. You can imagine what you're faced with. So this is a real issue. It's a very concrete issue. You need to be clear about where you draw the line. This is what Lee and Preston emphasize. The difficult part is to define logical lines of demarcation and practical guidelines based on what the firm actually does and the impact it actually has on society. And from their perspective, the principle of public responsibility extends the firm's responsibility to its primary involvement, those things it chooses to do, and secondary involvement, those impacts that flow from its primary activities, but no further. So that's how they come to a determination of where you draw the line. And they also emphasize that context matters for where the line is drawn. And they mention they were writing in the mid-70s, and the new edition also brings up later events, but here they mention landmark catastrophes, environmental catastrophes that have occurred. And they say each disaster raises anew issues of liability and accountability and calls to redefine corporate responsibility. So, lines of demarcation, a corporation cannot be held responsible for nothing. Also, it cannot be held responsible for everything. But how do you think about responsibility with respect to this line of demarcation? And here I want to emphasize that, in my view, responsibility is not reducible to preferences. That acting responsibly requires an awareness of the broader social context the firm operates in, and responsibility refers to values, beliefs, and principles. Another important aspect of responsibility is the problem of authenticity. True corporate responsibility comes from the inside, from corporate culture, day-to-day decision-making. It cannot be an add-on to improve a brand or the reputation of the company. That's important. Responsibility evokes ideas of obligation, like Maurice Clark mentioned, virtue, truthfulness, and part of truthfulness is understanding reality, understanding the context in which you operate and the impacts and your broader responsibility in that context. Here, there's a very nice quote, a survey on very nice survey on the literature, management literature on corporate social responsibility by Visser, and here's how he puts it. Unfortunately, most companies stuck in the ages of greed, philanthropy, marketing, and management are all still in denial, thinking that either there is no problem, or it's not their problem, or that it's a problem to benefit from, or that it's only a minor problem. Also, corporate responsibility is not reducible to stakeholderism. It's a separate concept, separate idea. The stakeholder theory of the corporation is mostly about giving voice to other stakeholders than shareholders. For example, co-determination in Germany. It's about reconciling the different interests of stakeholders. But the link to the notion of corporate responsibility under stakeholderism is tenuous. There was a link, you'll see that on the next slide, I'll mention it, but this link has disappeared. And also, stakeholderism does not rule out irresponsible corporate action. One example that struck me recently is, maybe Martin, you may have read about this. This is a German company, Meyer Werft, which basically is bankrupt and is being bailed out by the German government. There's a bailout in August 24. And what does this company do? It produces cruise ships. It's a German cruise ship builder. Now, if you had the choice of do you build or don't build cruise ships, and you were looking at this in a responsible way, you would choose not to build cruise ships. Cruise ships have a terrible environmental record, terrible environmental damage. But here you have the German government putting billions into this company with the support of the workers, of course, to continue operations that are very bad for the world. So this is stakeholderism, but it's not corporate responsibility. So the meaning, I mentioned that a little earlier, but let me now emphasize this. So the meaning of corporate social responsibility. We see this everywhere. So usually the acronym CSR, and then CSR this, CSR that, ESG this, ESG that. And what I want to point out is that this meaning has, over time, has been corrupted. So after the Maurice Clark article of 1916, the other major contribution in this area is by Howard Bowen. So he's a management scholar, and he wrote a very important book in 1953, Social Responsibilities of the Businessman. And he's widely credited as having launched the theme of corporate social responsibility. And when you read the book, yeah, there are connections with the idea of some of the ideas I mentioned in previous slides. This has led to a fairly large literature, and one of the leaders of this literature is Archie Carroll. And he moved from the initial ideas that Bowen put on the table to different version under the heading corporate social responsiveness. So it was no longer responsibility, it's responsiveness. And then he moved on to the notion of corporate social performance. So you got rid of responsibility, you talk about responsiveness, and then you talk about performance. And then in the end, what is it all about? Well, it's doing well by doing good. That's the essential conclusion. It pays to do good. And the ultimate version of that is Porter and Kramer, where they say, actually, you should think of strategic CSR. And you should see CSR as a competitive advantage. Here's another quote from another a very nice survey of this literature by Lee, who basically concludes corporate social responsibility is no longer conceived as a moral responsibility of corporate managers for greater social good, but as strategic resources to be used to improve the bottom line performance of the corporation. So if you want to act responsibly, what other things that could this imply besides an awareness of the context, an awareness of your responsibility not to create undue harm? What I want to emphasize here is that seen as involving more than just individual corporate behavior, that there's an element of collective action involved in economic responsibility, an element of coalition building for more to have more of a to be able to make more of a difference. Here I found a nice little quote in the Baumol piece that highlights that. For business firms, this is often a matter which can only be dealt with collectively by voluntary groupings of firms rather than by individual enterprises. And here you have a few examples of such coalitions that are making a big difference today. In particular, I had some involvement with UN Global Compact, which I thought was a really amazing initiative, and they're trying to really enhance more responsible corporate behavior around the world, and to build a broad coalition of companies. But you have on the climate space, you have NGOs like CDP, SBTI, and on the investor side, you have Climate Action 100+, and IFRS. Okay, so this brings me to the economic responsibility of investors. Let me return to the Maurice Clark article. Here's what he says on investor responsibility. The eggs are in many baskets, and the baskets cannot all be watched. But long before this point is reached, the watching is reduced to the bare essentials necessary to knowing if the investment is profitable and safe. When the investor's familiarity dwindles to the irreducible money-making minimum, something has evaporated, and that something is a social interest of incalculable importance. So that's how Maurice Clark, that's his angle of approach on investor responsibility. He says that what has gotten in the way, this is 1916. You have to imagine how much he's anticipated. What gets in the way is the idea of diversification. Diversification involves a loss of information and a loss of engagement with the issues that the companies have to deal with. And then he argues, private fortunes may be safer, but not without cost to the nation. And he asks rhetorically, has the principle of limited liability been carried too far? If a moderate curtailment of that privilege should result in concentrating each man's investments in fewer enterprises, the Commonwealth would be the gainer in a very real way. So I want to now add a few more thoughts on this suggestion that maybe the principle of limited liability has been carried too far. And I want to bring to your attention a very recent article by a legal scholar, Mariana Pargendler, which really goes in this direction and says a lot of interesting things about how you might go from the idea of economic responsibility to closing what Maurice Clark called the twilight zone, closing that twilight zone and try and bring the law up to date by moving what is purely a principled perspective, a moral perspective, to more of a legal responsibility, a notion of legal responsibility. And she points out that a lot of interesting legal work has been done in emerging market countries such as Brazil and India on the idea that, well, maybe we need to revisit the extent to which we want to have limited liability. And she points to, for example, Brazil's Consumer Protection Code, which was introduced in the 1990s, and Brazil's Environmental Protection Statute of 1998, and basically puts down into law the principle that judges can pierce the corporate veil, and here I've highlighted this, whenever it is in any way an obstacle to the compensation of harm caused to consumers or to the quality of the environment. And similarly, India's Companies Act of 2013 goes in that direction and requires that directors, in quotes, shall act in good faith in order to promote the objects of the company for the benefit of its members as a whole and in the best interests of the company's employees, the shareholders, the community, and the protection of environment. So this is the extra step taken, and there's some of that also in the UK's Companies Act, where there is a reference to the impact of the company's operations on the community and the environment. Charles Goodhart has made a suggestion on limited liability that I wanted to flag as well in an article titled "The Moral Hazard of Limited Liability." And here's what he says. He says, the predominant example of moral hazard has been the application of limited liability to the shareholders of publicly listed private sector corporations. faced with the likelihood that limited liability, so I'm going too fast. So he points out that moral hazard, a form of moral hazard that is brought about by the limited liability protection, he has in mind more the financial risks that can lead to financial crisis, but you can apply that analysis also to the environment and may cause this moral hazard problem. The standard response has been to impose direct regulation on the relevant sectors. And in similar ways as Maurice Clark, he says, well, maybe we should consider an alternative approach to such moral hazard, which is not to regulate, but to change the incentive structure of all those immediately involved. And then he and his co-author outline a proposal, which I think is worth considering, certainly worth knowing about, where he thinks of two classes of equity holders, those with no informational control, retail investors, and they think that for them it may be appropriate to have limited liability, but those that have both the information and the capacity to influence corporate decision-making, which is controlling shareholders and institutional investors, they should have unlimited liability. I'm conscious of running almost out of time, so this is my last slide. So here are my concluding thoughts. So I have sought to argue that the notion of economic responsibility must be integrated in mainstream economic analysis of the firm. That's what I've tried to do here. But I'm conscious of the fact that I'm only opening the discussion here. This is just the first engagement with the issues. Much more thinking and exploration of what it means to be economically responsible is needed. And partly behaving in a responsible way is something, it's not, you're not born responsible or irresponsible. That's partly a matter of education. And that's why it's an important aspect of how we think in terms of corporate behavior and the theory of the firm. And let me finish by saying that the idea that the pursuit of self-interest alone, without regard to the broader socio-economic context, will somehow result in some approximately efficient outcome is no longer tenable. I think we will agree with that. And the idea that the economic life in the marketplace and firms can be separated, I'm reading too fast. Let me start again. The idea that economic life in the marketplace and firms can be separated from social and political life, that individual economic agents' behavior can be reduced to playing a game, the rules of which are being set from the outside through an autonomous political process, is also no longer tenable. Finally, to come back to Maurice Clark's words, in my view, there is a growing twilight zone of obligations, not yet enforced by law or custom. And what's worse is time is running out. We may only have a few more decades left to solve the climate crisis. So it's all the more urgent to bring these ideas into economics and to make them concrete and part of our theory of the firm in today's world. With that, thank you.
Patrick, thank you very much for your fascinating presentation. Well, now we have a good amount of time left to have a little bit of Q&A and discuss your ideas. We have, of course, both people online and here. So if you are here in the room, just raise your hand and I'll call on you, and then you'll get the microphone and you can ask your question. Please quickly introduce yourself. If you're online, then please type your question into the Q&A box. We'll start with a round of questions, maybe 3 questions here in the room. Then we'll see if we have some online and go from there. So let's see if we have some comments. We'll start right there. Thank you.
Hello, thank you so much for your presentation. My name is Karina, and I'm a student at LSE, the program for Psychology of Economic Life. I'm curious to hear your thoughts around the newly introduced initiative, or rather legislature in the EU. The name is Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, which was enforced last year, and then the first reporting cycle will be early next year. But it's not around the actual reporting and the metrics that will be delivered by this broad number of new companies, or rather SMEs and listed companies. But what is the effectiveness of that? As in, reporting and publishing reports is one thing, but then whether the actual action will be taken internally, as in changing the business models, the company structure. So yeah, just to hear your thoughts about the efficiency.
Why don't I answer your question? Perfect. So yeah, you're absolutely right. So CSRD is a major new set of regulations in the EU that require much more extensive disclosure of climate impact, primarily in terms of the types of greenhouse gas emissions that companies have, and in terms of what they're planning to do about it in terms of future decarbonization. And the EU is really the leader in the world with respect to these regulations. As you pointed out, it's first mostly large companies that are now being targeted, and listed companies, but eventually this will also apply to non-listed companies and to smaller, medium-sized companies. And so the fact that this is gradual, I think, is a good thing, because nobody really knows how to do this in a cost-efficient way yet. I think a lot of the rules still need to be determined. Some learning involved, but the general spirit, which is that you need to provide that information to the broader world, in particular investors, it's a good thing. Now, of course, in other parts of the world, there's much less enthusiasm for this with this type of regulation. But I will stop here.
Just wait for the microphone for a second.
Frank Venmans, professor at the LSE. There are people thinking about how would we possibly pay in the future for negative emissions, because they're very expensive. And one of the ideas is to make companies liable for their emissions, in the sense that in the possibly far future they have to absorb them again and correct for their emissions that they emit today. And thinking of your last proposal that there might be unlimited liability if companies would go bankrupt in the meantime, the main shareholders could still be liable. Do you think that there is value in that proposal? Would that practically be doable, making companies liable for their current emissions in the future?
So I think in your question is the view that if we make companies liable for their emissions, the harm caused by their emissions, they might no longer be profitable, right? That's implicit in what you're saying. Now, you know, from an economic and social efficiency point of view, maybe that's a good outcome, that they're no longer profitable, they stop operating. So I think the real issue is, why have we let companies get away with not being liable, and shareholders get away with not being liable for enormous harm made to the world, to society, to the climate? And we are in a really difficult situation today. We see the climate crisis get out of hand, I mean, the consequences are not to be, we have to look at reality and you know, not deny what is happening. And when we see the challenge today, you have to ask, why aren't we making companies more liable and shareholders more liable for activities that contribute to this harm and to this crisis? I mean, that's a basic, you know, basic tort principle. If you cause harm, you are responsible and you may be liable and you need to pay damages.
Oliver had a question.
Well, first, I very much enjoyed the lecture. I think the idea of responsibility is a very appealing one, but I'm trying to understand how it would work in practice. I mean, if I'm an oil company and I'm emitting carbon, and you know, I'm not breaking any laws, is your idea that I am clearly causing damage to the environment? Should I be paying something for that, even though I don't have an obligation to do it? Should I be acting as if there is a carbon tax? And should I therefore make a contribution? And to whom would I make it? And is it really, I'm also thinking, you know, I drive to work, okay, and I'm unfortunately still use a gas guzzler, not the worst, but, and so, you know, is it up to me? Maybe it is, but I just don't know how many people would do it, would again pay something, even though the government is not requiring me to do it.
No, absolutely right. It ends up being a practical question. So the way you've described it is correct. Is you shouldn't wait for the activity to be made illegal. You know you're causing harm. You're behaving within the law. But if you take Maurice Clark's view, that doesn't mean you should do it. You may want to change your behavior because you feel, if you're acting responsibly, because you recognize you're causing harm. Now that could be taking many different forms. You suggested paying a tax even if you don't owe one. That could be one way. But another way is you could take more immediate and deliberate action to reduce your carbon emissions. So, for example, with oil exploration, oil extraction, a major source of greenhouse gases is methane emissions that just come from the extraction process. And this has been, on the table for decades. People have pointed out these methane emissions. They should be stopped, and there's technology available to stop them. It's costly. You're an oil major, you're like Exxon, you're making a lot of money, especially during the energy crisis. You can pay for these investments. It's not going to set the shareholders back very much. You're doing something for the good of the world. That's what I would call acting responsibly. And then your example about driving or flying. Well, yeah, we know it's sometimes we have to do it. We have no choice. But when we have a choice, we should be thinking about what we're doing. We should not just think that because it's legal, it's no problem. That's what I want to argue, and I think that's what Maurice Clark means, and that's the kind of education that you want to bring to companies, to how we teach economics, how we teach economic behavior. We can't just say it's not economics. I think today it's sufficiently important that we need to make it part of economics. That's what I want to argue.
Before we do another round in the room, Ulrike, do we have any online questions from our hybrid online audience?
We do. Oh, hello. Yes, we do. First question from the online audience, posted anonymously. Does the US government use tech firms to promote liberty, freedom and economic development around the world? Are those tech firms responsible and good or neo-colonial? Do you want more than one question?
Yeah, let me quickly answer that. So there are many things you could say about tech. This is really an area where, to bring back this image of the Twilight Zone, this is really an area where the Twilight Zone has grown enormous. The law is way behind what we think is appropriate behavior and what is tolerable. There are plenty of examples that we can think of really bad stuff that happens on the internet that shouldn't be allowed to happen, that it should be the responsibility of these companies not to allow it. All the social content, harmful social media content that you can find on the web, that it's legal. You have, the law has been structured in a certain way in the US to allow these companies to avoid liability. It's totally irresponsible, and we should call it out. I think this is an area where we should call it out, and if we can act more openly to also help bring about legal change, that would be a good thing. So yeah, absolutely.
Another question from the online audience, Ulrike?
Yes, there's been a question posted by Pierre Chenot. Interesting, but how is the principle of unlimited liability supposed to work in practice? To be workable, wouldn't it require that there's both awareness and broad agreement regarding all the potential future effects of some actions? In many cases, especially when it comes to the effect of some action on the climate, this seems unrealistic. Thousands of factors presumably matter in a way that is very hard to measure. For example, carbon emissions are not the only consideration.
Yeah, no, this is absolutely a valid concern. You have to be careful how you do it. I mean, limited liability is a very convenient rule because it allows you to basically simplify things drastically, but you're oversimplifying things. And so when it comes to the harm caused to the climate from greenhouse gas emissions, so now there are lots of lawsuits around the world on this. They're sort of held up because courts are stuck on this idea of attribution. Maybe we're worrying too much about attribution. Maybe going in the direction of saying, well, we can verify how much you emitted in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. We can tell the science is good enough to say how much harm that contributes. And on that basis, we can find a way of imposing damages and legal liability. I don't see this as necessarily a very insurmountable problem. Now, of course, you have to do it carefully, but that does not mean that you shouldn't do it at all. Again, this idea that, I mentioned Donaldson and Preston, it's a line drawing problem, and it's not there's no easy answer. There's no computer code you can write and say this is the line. Unfortunately, a lot of judgment is involved, but the fact that there is a lot of judgment involved doesn't mean you shouldn't try and draw the line somewhere. That's the point.
Let's go back to questions in the room. I think there were, yes, let's start right in front there.
Yeah, thanks very much, Patrick. Tom Gosling here. You talked about responsibility coming from within and there being a sort of an intrinsic and cultural element to it. And I think in a lot of efforts to promote culture through, for example, corporate governance codes, the UK corporate governance code says quite a lot about culture. There's a recognition that it's a tough thing, to regulate. and that also speaks to your fact that regulation can't keep up. But then the problem is we often see that financial incentives overwhelm culture quite often when we see scandals, and that suggests that we do need, you know, kind of hard consequences as well. I'm just wondering how you see the balance of different mechanisms for promoting good culture versus the stick of enforcement and the sort of encouragement of more sort of code-based approaches.
Yeah, my thinking is we're, you know, despite the rise in the CSR movement, ESG movement, we haven't really enough paid attention to the very notion of responsibility and how we might act responsibly and how we can act more responsibly, despite an economic environment where, yeah, and there's so much focus on the bottom line, making money, profit, rewarding profit performance. So we need to educate. We need to start with education. The codes help, but we need to do a lot more. And here's where I really found the efforts that the UN Global Compact is making really very helpful. So they really try and engage with companies, ask the questions in very concrete ways. How would you make decisions when you face this particular dilemma? How would you make a decision for this other dilemma? How can we then learn from your experience, generalize it, make it available to others? So it's a big effort we have to make. But I think we're just starting. My view is we're just starting. We should go a lot further.
All the way in the back.
With your comment regarding unlimited liability, are we willing to stretch it and take it to persons of significant control and ultimate beneficial owners, not just the shareholders and directors?
So you're asking about I couldn't hear the end of your question. So you're asking about limited liability.
So unlimited liability.
Unlimited liability, and who should be held?
Are we willing to explore extending it to persons of significant control and ultimate beneficial owners?
So I'm not sure I fully understood your question, but let me come back to what the proposal by Hart is, which is to say that if you have the information and you are able to act or influence behavior in the company as an investor, there are grounds for extending liability beyond, to make you liable beyond strict limited liability, as a way of creating the financial incentives. It's coming back to Tom's question, creating then a financial incentive to really take the harms you might cause seriously and try and avoid causing those harms. So that's the idea.
Let's maybe move to, we have the microphone already here.
Right, thank you. You can hear me, right? So my name is Ben Groom. I'm from the University of Exeter, but also a visitor at the LSE. I'm an environmental economist, and it struck me that there's a kind of parallel set of literatures that you could have gone through historically, which would lead to a very different kind of answer to the one you have. I really enjoyed the presentation, but one could have started with Smith and then through like Pigou and then probably Arrow and stuff like that. And they just, it struck me that there's actually a lot of advantages of thinking about firms just as these atomistic kind of bodies and taking the view that this is really just about externalities, measuring externalities, pricing externalities, and once you have that, then firms very quickly understand what their responsibilities are rather than waiting for them to kind of decide the kind of extent of their responsibilities. So I guess this is the theory of change in environmental economics. I don't say it's the best one, but I'm just sort of putting the point that there's some advantages for thinking about the world this way. Consider, for instance, the European trading system for carbon, right? That comes directly from that sort of theory of change. It's a cap and trade system. There's a price. Every company pays a price, and that's in it pays a price, and the outcomes have been good. So I just wondered whether you could reflect on these sort of parallel theories of change, if you like, that that are proposed.
Yeah. So I mean, maybe I went a bit too quickly over some of the slides. So what you're saying is in effect what Baumol has been saying, right? So you had the Baumol slide saying private provision of public goods, the first point that Maurice Clark makes is to say that traditionally we have just thought about two polar cases, laissez-faire versus government intervention. So when laissez-faire is inefficient, leads to externalities, we then say, well, let's turn to government intervention, which are the examples that you're mentioning, right? But I think what's interesting in what Maurice Clark is saying is that there's also a middle ground that we need to think about. So it's not saying one or the other. It's saying it's an additional set of considerations we need to bring to the table. And it goes back to what Oliver was saying earlier. It's like you may perfectly legally be able to cause a lot of harm, and if we took it by your analysis, we would say, well, as long as it's legal, it's fine. We wish the government wouldn't make it legal, but it's not happening. As long as it's not happening, it's fine. And Maurice Clark saying, no, it's not fine. Even when the government is not doing the right thing to internalize externalities, you need to think about what you can do on your own initiative. On your own initiative. That's the key. That's the key. And I think that changes the conversation. So, I'm not saying that's the only way forward, but it's an additional way forward, and we need to take it seriously.
Right, I've got two more people on our list. Let's go to David, and then here in the front, in the middle.
Thank you, Dave Kershaw from the law school, and thanks so much, Patrick, for your talk. So, I just don't think this concept of responsibility, as you set it out, is operational. Asking a company to take on that form of responsibility as an additional obligation drives additional cost. When other actors in the market are not behaving that way, that other cost equals losing market share and could ultimately result in failure. So on its own, this concept of responsibility just can't work in an effective market economy. Now, you can imagine ways in which you could try to connect it to something else, like a purposeful company when sustainability was part of that enabled value generation through bonding with customers or suppliers, or enabled sort of innovative, productive ideas within the corporation. But that's a separate idea. So responsibility on its own, I just don't see how that can work. And I wonder why there's this move to give up on the idea that the colleague mentioned a second ago, which is the old idea that we pursue value and we regulate the externalities that are generated. It seems to me that underpinning this rejection is a dated understanding of regulation.
Okay,
we live in a regulatory state.
Can I got your point.
No,
I get your.
Okay, sure, absolutely.
I disagree with what you say. I fundamentally disagree with what you say. So let me tell concretely why what you say is not correct. For example, when you decide how to get rid of your trash, you could recycle or not recycle, right? Recycling involves a cost. You have to be a little bit more careful about what you put in one bin, the other bin, right? You're saying we shouldn't do it because it involves a cost? That's just wrong. I'm sure you do recycling because you think it's the responsible thing to do, right? If it's responsible for you to do it, then it's also responsible for companies to do it. You cannot say that we're in a world where individuals act responsibly and companies do not act responsibly. That is inconsistent. That's not a correct description. Now, for example, let me now say, how a company like Coca-Cola, the worst polluter in the world for plastic, right? Can Coca-Cola do more to reduce plastic bottle pollution? Sure, absolutely. Nothing prevents Coca-Cola from doing this. Absolutely nothing. What is wrong is for Coca-Cola to wait for shareholder resolutions, to push it to do this, and then hesitating, and then dragging its feet, and so on, when it knows perfectly that it is single-handedly responsible for one of the worst pollution problems in the world.
We've got time for one more question. I think, gentlemen, they had your hand up for quite some time.
Michael Joffe, Imperial College. Really fascinating lecture, and I'm very attracted by your examples of Brazil and
India.
Yes, India, but also the idea that Charles Goodhart, I think it was, you said, talking about changing incentives and using the law to do that. And I really like the idea, but is a carrot enough? And ought we not be talking about a stick as well? And some form of punishment, for want of a better word. And I'm talking about the individuals, because we talk about the oil companies or Exxon or specific oil-producing countries, but should we not be at least naming and shaming the individuals? Maybe there's even scope for something like an international criminal court, you know, because the crisis, as you said, the crisis we're facing is, you know, existential.
Yeah, absolutely. There's no one perfect way forward, and the ideas that Charles Goodhart put on the table, they may not yet be ready for implementation. They may require more thinking, more elaboration. But I think that coming back to the Donaldson and Preston way of framing it, it can't be true that corporations shouldn't be responsible for anything. That just can't be true. Equally, it can't be true that corporations should be responsible for everything. So it's line drawing, and it's difficult to do line drawing, of course, but that's where we need to go. I think we need to open that box. We've kept it closed for too long.
I know some other hands were up, but I think we're getting close to... You want to take one more? Excellent. There we go. We'll do two more then, because the gentleman up here set his hand up, so we'll do these two. It's great we're having such a lively discussion here, and so...
Again, thank you, Patrick, for this very interesting talk. I believe that there is something that you might have neglected and might add to the discussion, and this is market structure. When you see a large number of, for example, homogeneous products offered by banks in France, then you see one of the banks being exceedingly charitable vis-a-vis microfinance institutions, for example, putting a lot of money, and you wonder why are they putting so much money, especially in the middle of the 2008 crisis, right? And I did talk to the CEO, who told me, we do it for two reasons. One is advertisement. We want to attract clients. And the other one is because we want to avoid a lot of turnover. Our clients can easily move from one place to another. But if they know that we are doing something charitable, they might choose us, even though we pay them a little less, but they are happy, they are proud of working for us. So I believe that side is not yet explored. There is an incentive to well behave. And you see that in Switzerland. Why do people behave well even in the streets? Because they don't want to be badly seen, or quite the opposite. They want to be liked, right? Thank you.
Yeah, no, so there is a cultural element to responsibility. There's a cultural element. I think what you can't call acting responsibly is doing things like charitable activities just to improve your brand, right? Because it's not genuine. There has to be some genuine concern that drives the action. If it's just for window dressing purposes, then we're in quickly going down the road of greenwashing and all kinds of things. It has to be genuine, and it has to be based on a reflection of why you're doing it, what's the purpose. It can't just be a marketing exercise.
Right. Final question for the gentleman there.
Rob Bauer, Professor of Finance in Maastricht. Two observations. The first, you talk about in your talk about government, but of course there's not just one government. There are many governments, and they all have to work together. Second observation, capital flows freely across the globe. US investors invest, for instance, in our Dutch companies, influencing management with their views, their beliefs, their principles. So those two observations in mind, how are you going to solve these problems that you just mentioned?
Yeah, so as I emphasized, it's not just an individual firm problem. There's a collective action element. And when you look at organizations like UN Global Compact, that's how they're trying to respond in a very concrete way to your concerns that money, there's multiple governments, money may flow from one country to another. They're a global operation, and they're talking to companies, and they're trying to get companies to act collectively. Right? They're succeeding, but we should encourage them to do even more. And this should be something, in my view, that should be highlighted and emphasized and encouraged in our teaching. That's the point.
All right, Patrick, thank you very much for this fascinating lecture. And thanks to everybody for the great Q&A. And just a reminder, we have the drinks reception now in the atrium, and the stewards will guide you right there. If you'd like to join us, open for everybody. Thank you very much.